Hello and welcome to In Taiwan We Speak, your audio guide to Taiwan's mind-blowing linguistic diversity. I am Alexander Shin, and today I am joined here by Rebecca Lin, a student of international development at the University of Sussex, UK. She is British-Taiwanese. She spent most of her life in the UK, but recently she decided to come to Taiwan, her mom's homeland. Here, Rebecca continued her studies, but also managed to put together a very meaningful project, an art exhibition featuring works of Indigenous artists titled Formosan Futures. Hi, Rebecca. Glad to see you here in our studio.
Thank you, Oleg, for your beautiful introduction.
First of all, I know that yesterday there was the closing of your exhibition, the closing ceremony, should we say?
That's right. It was a bit of a closing event/party.
Congratulations on successfully completing the exhibition that lasted, I think, 2 months, right?
Nearly 2 months, yeah.
Also, I'm sure our listeners can hear the sound of your earrings, and they're quite beautiful. Yes, thank you so much. These are Paiwan inspired, right?
Yeah, so this is actually both my earrings and this necklace were from a shop in the town that I just spent the last month staying in Taidong, and my Paiwan friend invited me into her home, and her mum said, "You're here for a while. I think we need to get you some of the goods." So we went there to get me a vest because it was the Harvest Festival coming up.
Right.
So I had to look the part, and actually the lovely Ai running the shop gifted me these because
that's sweet.
Yeah, I got the other bits and bobs to go with it. So yes, thank you very much.
Now I would like to talk about your very interesting background. You're half Taiwanese, but you mentioned once to me that you grew up with very little connection to Taiwan, right? What inspired you? What motivated you to come to Taiwan at this point of your life?
Actually, the first time I came to Taiwan was only in 2019. As you said, I was raised in the UK by my mum, who is Taiwanese. And since at that time, we weren't financially able to come visit. First visited in 2019 when I had this almost epiphany that there was this massive chunk of myself that is missing. Like, I don't understand it. I've never been able to face up to it. I've never even been able to learn Chinese. You know, after that first trip, I could not stop thinking about coming back. So I did. I decided to tie it into my studies. And I feel since being here, despite the fact I see myself as having quite a Taiwanese heart, you know, I was raised by my mum, so I feel like I see the world like her, you know, more or less. I grew up in a very diverse part of the UK, a city called Leicester, but I still felt, you know, I was not British, I wasn't English, I wasn't white. But if you look at me, it's quite hard to notice much more than my Britishness, which is kind of the struggle that I had in the UK, and what I'm facing more now that I'm in Taiwan is I feel Taiwanese, but I do not look it. So it's kind of been, most importantly, a journey to assert my Taiwanese-ness, I would say. So now that you've spent over a year here in Taiwan, how do you feel about being back here? The more time I spend here, the more I have to learn about both Taiwan and myself. I do realize that this is what I should be doing in my 20s, is sort of looking into the dark depths of myself that I've never really been able to get to know. It feels very good.
Many of the things you say I can actually understand. Many, I guess, kids either from migrant families or historical diaspora communities, you sort of have this connection to your, let's say, historical motherland through that small window that your parents provided you with. But when you visit it, you realize that's the whole universe to discover.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you are enjoying that journey. Now, this is a podcast about languages. I know most of the time we're talking about everything else but languages, but that makes total sense to me because I do believe that language is the cornerstone of everything in our lives. That's why we end up talking about culture, society at large, history. I have to ask you, though, in your life, in your childhood, Taiwanese languages, to what extent were they present there?
I think I had the idea in my mind that I was Taiwanese, or at least half Taiwanese when I was younger, but didn't really have anything to show for it in a language sense, because when my mum moved to the UK nearly 30 years ago now, I think her pursuit was to integrate, and I think you could almost say assimilate into British society, because I think at the time it still was almost a selectively hostile place for some immigrants. I did not learn or hear any Chinese when I was growing up, except in the Chinese supermarket and the restaurant that my mum worked at. Both of those were run by mainland Chinese people. At that point, I still didn't really realize that there was much of a difference, because my mum would describe herself as Chinese. I think she grew up in that sort of era where that was the identity that you were told to embrace. So maybe in my mum's workplaces, I heard a bit of Chinese, and she would call her mum or my amma once or twice a year, and I would hear them speaking something that doesn't quite sound Chinese. I never knew what it was until recent years. I realized it's Taiyu.
Right.
So I was so disconnected from my own heritage and my mother tongue that I couldn't even distinguish between a dialect, which is extremely different in many ways.
Many call it language for that same reason.
Exactly. So I would hear their conversations and some small words here and there in Chinese, but overall it was all English.
I have to mention, of course, for our listeners, Taiyu is what we call Taigi in English, or Taiwanese, although some people prefer not to call it Taiwanese, since many other languages are also Taiwanese in Taiwan. But it's one of the most popular ways to call this language. Now, of course, let's talk about Formosan Futures. Such a big exhibition. And I think it is big because there's 15 artists involved, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Great job there. So I have to ask you, of course, what motivated you to come up with this project, and why Indigenous artists and why Indigenous art?
First of all, my academic interest has kind of crawled into the realms of Indigenous rights and livelihoods since around 2019, 2020, after I spent some time living in the north of Thailand with a host family there. And they're from the Karen group, many of which have historically migrated from Myanmar. After my time living with this beautiful host family who adopted me as their own, I kind of very consciously reoriented my academic interest to Indigenous, or specifically Karen rights. A lot of it is around land rights and issues of cultural preservation, because this is something that the Thai government is still lacking on in many ways. So when I came back to the UK and when I sort of began to get very invested in these issues of Karen, in school I didn't learn anything about Taiwan. So when I decided to come here to study, I also reoriented my research interests. It was at first Taiwan Indigenous language policies, or like multicultural language policies. I first wrote an essay about just that. How has the evolution of Taiwan language policy over time impacted certain communities? In what way? And I just realized I opened a can of worms. So I was able to slowly get to know my motherland through this academic route. And now that I started this project, I almost wanted to find a way to understand these perspectives in a more inclusive and maybe in a more expressive way than a formal research project.
Is that why it's called Formosan Futures in plural?
Well, I mean, being a student of international development and having to learn about the colonial implications of everything, I was reluctant to use the word Formosan because, of course, this is the Portuguese word used to describe Taiwan in, the early days of colonial encounter, we could say. I used it for stylistic purposes, and futures, you're right. It's almost trying to represent the plurality of Taiwanese identity as a whole, but especially Taiwanese Indigenous identity.
Yeah, I personally prefer the word Formosan, to be honest, because yes, it's used widely in the linguistics to denominate the languages, Austronesian languages, mostly on the main island, I think. But also, I think the word itself is quite beautiful. And what I appreciate the most is, yes, it was given by, well, I wouldn't call Portuguese colonizers because they didn't quite manage to. I'm sure they would have.
Sure they would have.
But also the word is sort of detached from, many other names of Taiwan that today have a lot of political, geopolitical underpinnings, and this word is just beautiful. I think the way its meaning also presents itself. Formosa, beautiful. So let's talk about Formosan Futures itself. What are some of the artists? I know you would want to introduce all of them, obviously, but let's say for people who didn't manage to see the exhibition like yours truly, what are some of the artists and some of the works that they presented at this exhibition?
So the project actually started as an open call. So I invited anyone and everyone in Taiwan to submit any work related to Indigenous Taiwanese identity. I kind of kept the guidelines very vague, opening up that platform and setting two themes, which is roots in the tree sense, in the underground growing roots sense, and roots, which is, of the journey through the ocean, whatever, roots and roots. From that open call, the submissions came rolling in, and we ended up with very diverse sets of artwork, from poetry to song lyrics. We have some sculptures, we even have an AI submission, journal entries and other forms. So it was pretty boundless. I really loved some of the song lyrics that were submitted, because I think music is such an intimate thing, right? I love that as an art form. So some of the lyrics really struck me, but there were many, many different ones that were submitted.
You did mention an AI submission. I'm really curious about that one. What kind of work of art is that one?
I didn't give these formal guidelines as to what constitutes art purposefully. So I had one submission come through. It was actually two series of writing, short paragraphs about the history and the situation of Basai people in Taiwan. And I thought, I have never heard of this Indigenous group. I did some research, and it turns out to be one of Taiwan's Indigenous groups that virtually now doesn't exist. The language, the traditions, the culture, pretty much non-existent now.
Is the one that lived in Taipei area, right?
Yes. The artists attempt to sort of process these feelings of, how can I connect something that I have lost any means of reaching? So he wrote some beautiful words, and alongside this was a project that he has been working on. AI component was a website he'd created for people to differentiate different species of marine life in Taiwan.
Oh, wow.
So you can upload a photo and it will analyze it and tell you what species it is. So we had lots of fun uploading photos of things that very much were not marine animals and seeing what it said.
That's the fun part of AI.
Exactly.
You want to test it.
So I loved the fact that it got people involved in unexpected ways. He said to me, I don't know if this counts as art. And, to some people it might not, but actually it was a very interesting addition to, the rich other pieces that we had.
Now, after completing this major project, having lived in Taiwan for over a year now, what do you make of Taiwan's linguistic, but also cultural in general, diversity now?
I think since my main pursuit this year wasn't only to assert my Taiwanese identity, it was to learn Chinese, or at least begin that journey, because it was truly at beginner's level before I came here. This project, I think this was kind of the tipping point where I realized that I'm creating a new version of myself that I have never known before. When you have language, you have many other things, not only the sense of belonging and identity that it gives to you, but you have the ability to communicate and to express. So through this project and the trip that I have just returned from, after the launch event for Formosan Futures, I went to Taitung for a month to stay near my friend's village. And less people in Taitung are speaking English. Was able to learn about the efforts of 2 villages in conservation, preservation and promotion of both their culture, Paiwan culture and language. Since Taiwan is going through such a particular point of its own identity and its development, it's more important now than ever to be speaking about what makes Taiwan Taiwanese. Space for improvement in Taiwan is placing more value on preservation is something that takes policy change. It takes a whole nationwide effort to pick up the responsibility to understand these identities, these languages. You know, it shouldn't just be placed on the less than 3%. You know, it's all of our duty, I think.
Well, thank you so much for that message, but also for sharing your journey. Beautiful conclusion that you gave us, I think, sums up a lot of things that many guests come here to share. Thank you, Rebecca, for joining me here today. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. My name is Oleg, and see you next week.
That coastline from my memories. Oh, that mountain from my dreams. I thought I had long forgotten them, yet they replay non-stop in my mind. That which is most powerful, the place you can never return to, yet is most longed after. Why are the innocent so desperate to be forgiven, when your delirium and inexplicable sadness all stem from it? The homeland I cannot return to. No, I refuse to be a wandering vagrant no more. These are the translated lyrics to Kavulungan, submitted to the Formosan Futures exhibition project by Giyu Tjuljaviya, who speaks about the journey returning to his mum's home village in Taitung, where he never really spent much time when he was growing up. And he says this about the song. I have always thought that the distance between me sitting on the train and the village as a metaphor of the distance between me and my Paiwan heritage. I know I originate here, but I don't know how to return, how to walk back into this community, how to be accepted, let alone how to accept myself. And it's exactly this struggle for belonging that motivated the project, something that I experienced when I was growing up in England with no connection to my Taiwanese heritage. So I really hope you enjoy this episode, and thank you so much for listening.
Masih Taiwan.